Welcome back. Today, you ask OpenCode to read a file, and use what it learns to improve your commands. By the end of this lesson, you will know exactly how to ask OpenCode to open a file on your computer, read what is inside it, and then use that understanding to make your /review command genuinely smarter and more helpful. Reading is the quiet, unglamorous skill behind almost every useful thing OpenCode ever does for you, and today you take full ownership of it. OpenCode can read files. That might sound obvious, but it is worth pausing on, because it is one of the things that makes it genuinely different from a chatbot in a browser window. When you point OpenCode at a file, it opens that file, reads through every line, and actually understands the contents, the structure, the names, the logic, the patterns. It is not guessing. It has looked, carefully, at your work. Why does reading matter so much? Because before /review can check your code for problems, OpenCode first needs to read that code. It cannot review what it has not seen. The same is true for almost anything useful: explaining, summarizing, improving. Reading always comes first. Understand the file, then say something meaningful about it. That order never changes, no matter what you are working on. Here is how you actually ask. You point OpenCode at a file, and then you write something simple: read this file and explain it. That is all. OpenCode opens the file, reads through it carefully, and answers you back in plain everyday English. You do not need special words or a secret syntax. Just describe what you want, the way you would describe it to a person sitting right next to you. A good question gets a good reading. If you only say read this, OpenCode will read it and give you something general back. But if you say read this and explain what each part does, or read this and tell me what is unclear, you get something far more useful. Be specific about what you want. Explain it, summarize it, find problems in it. The quality of what comes back depends almost entirely on the quality of what you ask for in the first place. So what is actually happening when OpenCode reads? It opens the file on your computer, the same way you would. It moves through every line, from top to bottom. And as it reads, it grasps the structure, the names you chose, the logic you wrote, the patterns that repeat. It builds a real understanding of what the file does, not just a surface scan of the words sitting there on the page. Here is something worth understanding. When OpenCode reads a file, the contents of that file enter its awareness. They become part of the context for everything it says next. So when it answers you, it is not speaking in generalities. It is speaking about your file, specifically, because it just read it. That is what makes the answer feel relevant and grounded rather than generic and disconnected. Here is where reading becomes genuinely powerful: research. Instead of asking OpenCode to just explain a file, ask it something like, what should my /review check in files like this? OpenCode reads the file, reflects on the patterns it sees, and gives you back a tailored, specific checklist of things worth looking for. You are using its careful reading to inform your own decisions and designs, and then you use that answer. OpenCode's reading tells you what actually matters in files like yours: the naming problems, the missing error checks, the repeated patterns. You take that knowledge and you fold it into how you design your /review command. The command gets smarter, not because of magic, but because you did your research first, with OpenCode as your patient and careful reader. Sometimes you want more than a summary. You want depth. So you ask OpenCode to explain the file line by line. And it does exactly that. It walks through the file with you, one section at a time, translating what each part does into plain everyday English. This is wonderful when you are looking at code you did not write, or code you wrote a long time ago and have since quietly forgotten. Let me clear up something that trips people up. In an earlier lesson, you learned about the @mention, the way you point OpenCode at a specific file. Pointing and reading are two different things. The @mention is how you aim. Reading is what OpenCode does once you have aimed. They work together, but they are not the same step, and knowing the difference keeps things clear and tidy in your head. When OpenCode reads, it does not just scan word by word like a simple search. It grasps patterns. It sees how the pieces fit together, how one part calls another, how the names relate to the logic, where something feels off. That is why the feedback it gives you feels thoughtful and specific rather than mechanical. It understood the shape of what you wrote, not just the surface. Here is a lovely use for reading that people often overlook. Ask OpenCode to explain something you wrote yourself, especially code you have not touched in a while. Hearing your own work described back to you in plain English is a genuinely powerful way to rediscover what you were thinking. You understand your own work more deeply, and you often spot things you would otherwise completely miss. OpenCode reads best when the code is clear, standard patterns, sensible names, straightforward logic. When a file is well organized, OpenCode reads it confidently and accurately, and the feedback you get is sharp and trustworthy. This is one more quiet reason to keep your work tidy. Clear code is not just nicer for other humans. It is also easier for OpenCode to understand and genuinely help you with. Reading is harder for OpenCode when a file is very long or genuinely messy. A huge file can be difficult to hold all at once, and tangled, confusing code is harder to follow even for a careful reader. When you can, break big files into smaller, focused ones. It helps OpenCode read better, and, honestly, it helps you too. Small, clear files are easier for everyone, human and machine alike. So here is the natural shape of things, and it is worth holding on to. Read first. Understand second. Review third. OpenCode opens and reads the file, it builds an understanding of what the file does and how it fits together, and only then, once it actually understands, does it give you feedback. That order is the difference between a thoughtful review and a shallow guess. Never skip the reading step, and here is how this connects to /review. When you run /review, the very first thing OpenCode does is read your file. Then it applies the checks you carefully designed: bugs, clarity, gaps. Reading is built right into the command, automatically, every single time. You do not have to ask for it separately. The reading happens first, quietly, and then the review follows naturally from it. This builds into a habit worth keeping for the rest of your time with OpenCode. Read before you decide. Ask before you build. When you are about to create something, a command, a prompt, anything reusable, spend a minute reading a real file first, with OpenCode's help. That minute of reading almost always saves you an hour of guessing later. It is the most underrated habit in all of this, by a wide margin. Let me recap the whole lesson. You can ask OpenCode to read any file on your computer, and it will open it, understand it, and tell you what it found. You use what it learns to make your commands smarter and more specific. And the golden rule is simple: always read before you review. Understand first, then give feedback. That order never changes, and it will serve you well for a very long time. Now it is your turn. Create a small sample file, anything will do, even a few lines of code or notes. Ask OpenCode to read it and explain it back to you. Then go one step further, ask what /review should check in files like this one. Listen to the answer, because that answer is the raw material for designing a command that genuinely fits the kind of work you actually do day to day. Here are a few words worth holding on to. Read: OpenCode opens a file and understands what is inside it. Context: the file's contents become part of what OpenCode is aware of as it answers you. Research: reading a real file first, before you decide or build, so your choices are grounded. And understanding: grasping the patterns and structure, not just scanning the individual words on the page. Everything useful that OpenCode does for you rests on one quiet foundation: reading. Let it look before it speaks. Let it understand your file before it offers advice, before it reviews, before it changes anything. That single habit, understand first, act second, will make every single thing you build with OpenCode more thoughtful, more accurate, and more genuinely helpful. Hold on to it tightly. Think of reading as absorption. OpenCode takes in the whole file, every line, every pattern, and holds it all in mind before it speaks a single word back to you. Understanding is not a single flash. It builds, line by line, until the whole picture comes gently into focus at last. A warm light passes over the content, and what was hidden in shadow becomes clear. That is exactly what careful reading does. Comprehension is quiet and patient. It does not rush. It sits with the material until it truly, deeply gets it. And then, from the reading, insight rises, a clear, specific understanding you can actually pick up and use. Thanks for spending this time with me. Next, you ask OpenCode to create and edit files. See you next time. Subscribe to catch the next lesson.